Alfie by Sarah Davy, written in January 2016. Alfie was a very friendly little boy who lived in a tall red-bricked house with wisteria advancing up the front and many pots going down the garden path to the lane in front. Alfie wore glasses and had chocolate-brown curly hair, with one particular curl that always dropped over his right eye. No matter how many times he swept it back, it always returned to its position over his right eye. He had a very endearing dimple in his chin that became even more of a dent when he smiled, which he often did. His mother often called him her little honey mouse, which frequently puzzled little Alfie, as he certainly wasn't a mouse, and his chocolate-brown hair could never be said to look like honey. He could only assume that it was because she must think he was sweet and was the smallest member of their big family. So, all in all, Alfie had a very happy life with his family in this red-bricked house with wisteria advancing up the front. But you are going to hear today how something really changed little Alfie. You have just heard how happy he was, but he was also very worried about getting told off, especially when he saw how his mum and dad's face changed from the sweet, gentle eyes and smiling mouth to the fierce, staring eyes and straight mouth, with such different sounds coming out from it. Oh, how their forehead changed so much! The furrows were so much longer and deeper even than his little dimple. The event which started the change in Alfie's life was on a wet day in springtime, when he came home from school after a PE lesson. The day had not started well, as Alfie was very upset that his favourite lesson of the week was going to have to be inside because of the rain. Mr. Tompkin, his teacher, always seemed to take the opportunity to cut their PE lesson short when it had to be inside. Alfie couldn't understand why Mr. Tompkin didn't cut their maths lesson short when it was raining. Grown-ups certainly had funny rules. As the lesson with Mr. Tompkin was at the end of the day, Alfie thought that even though the day had been spoilt, he could at least get dressed quickly and hasten going back home to his red-bricked house, where his mum might have something nice to eat after school. When he got home, his mum's first request was to go and change before he could have anything to eat. Angry with this, but realizing it is so much better to just do what grown-ups say sometimes, Alfie went upstairs to change. When he removed his school jumper, he suddenly saw the name Thomas Walker written on the neck. His heart jumped, especially when he didn't really like Thomas Walker, who always seemed to get everything right, and the teachers smiled at him so much more. In his haste to get dressed, he had picked up the wrong jumper. Alfie was worried to see all the grown-ups' angry, scowling faces, especially Mrs. Walker, who seemed to have an angry face even when she wasn't angry. So he decided to cut off the label and just pretend it was his own jumper. Climbing onto his mother's dressing table, he found a pair of her orange scissors. Even though he was a bit nervous, he decided this was certainly the best option. But the scissors were very sharp and a bit big for his little fingers. As he snipped, he suddenly realized that not only the label, but also a small chunk of the green jumper dropped to the ground. Oh no! Thomas Walker's school jumper now had a little diamond shape cut out of it. Now Alfie pictured the grown-ups' faces looking even more angry, and decided the only option was to run to the end of their garden and bury the jumper for no one to ever see again. There he was at the end of the garden, digging a hole frantically to fit the faded jumper in, when he heard his mum's voice calling, and then getting nearer and nearer. Before he had time to conceal the doomed jumper, his mother's shadow was looming from above. At this point, Alfie decided that the only possibility now was to burst into uncontrollable tears. His mother, noticing his apparent wretchedness, took him in her arms and cuddled him to her, asking what on earth was going on. Alfie sat down on a log covered with green moss, and feeling very comforted by both the snug log and his mother's kindness, told her the whole story. Alfie's mum put her warm, consoling arms around him and took full control of the situation. She phoned Mrs. Walker, who turned out not to be an ogre, and it emerged that Thomas had Alfie's jumper, and she was even quite happy to darn the little hole in the jumper. When Alfie was tucked up in bed by his mum and dad, they both said to him how much easier it was to admit straight away if something had happened, because, however much you try to conceal something, the problem has a nasty habit of getting worse and worse. 2 weeks later, Alfie was busy playing with his toy helicopter, and when, totally wrapped up in circling it round his cars on the floor, he knocked over his mum's favourite yellow vase with beautiful curled handles. The panic rose, and the sight of his mum's angry, glowering face came into his mind, so he rushed to the shattered vase and quickly gathered up the pieces and put them in the bin. 2 days later, Alfie's mum came in from the garden with a beautiful bunch of flowers. Fragrant daffodils would look so good in her favourite yellow vase. On looking round the room, she was puzzled where the vase had gone. Alfie appeared and was asked if he'd seen it, and the hot, flushed feeling on his face, along with the impossibility of looking into his mother's face, suddenly made Alfie seem curiously guilty. As before, Alfie dissolved into tears, and the story cascaded out with his mother looking on, rather angrily this time. She told the tearful little Alfie that she was a bit tired of him concealing all these things, and that really she was far more angry and upset that he had done so than having broken the vase itself. Luckily, the fragments of china were retrieved from the bin, and turned out to be not nearly as bad as Alfie had first thought. His clever dad managed to fix it all back together with his very handy glue. Mum at least had a vase vaguely resembling her original one. Not long after this vase was on the shelf in its new form with hairline cracks down it, poor Alfie had another very unfortunate situation. His big brother Toby, who had the same chocolate brown curls as Alfie, and had a nasty knack of leaving his mobile phone lying around. Well, on this day, Alfie came home from school, exhausted from the effort of concentrating and trying to work hard, and he flopped down on their lovely soft sofa. Instead of feeling himself sink into the soft cushions, he was met by an awful crunch. Directly below his bottom was Toby's phone, but not the phone that it was a few seconds ago, but a phone with a crack worming itself across the screen. The awful sick and heavy feeling filled Alfie's stomach, and he immediately thought of how he could hide the doomed phone. But as his thoughts went to trying to conceal the phone, he felt the most extraordinary feeling in his ears. They started to throb, and then to Alfie's horror, they grew and grew. And as they grew, they became curlier and curlier. Every orifice inside his ear felt like it was quivering. Poor Alfie was so distressed, he wasn't quite sure what was worse, having to go to school with ears like this, or face Toby's rage. As his ears became floppier, as they sprouted and grew, Alfie suddenly thought that maybe the wizardry taking over him was something to do with his plans to hide the broken phone from his big brother. So he sat down calmly and tried to decide what to do. When he realized that he would have to confess to Toby what had happened, almost immediately he started to feel better inside. The throbbing in his ears started to get less and less, and on jumping up towards the mirror, he saw that the ears he knew so well were returning. Suddenly he heard the front door open, and the familiar whistling of Toby came through the door. Alfie then went up to him, feeling very awkward and anxious inside, and making sure he covered his growing ears with his large green bobble hat, told him what had happened to his phone. To his complete amazement, Toby just looked at him and said, "Well, little bro," this is what he often called him, "it was pretty decent of you to tell me so quickly what had happened, but never fear, that was my old phone and I was going to offer it to you anyway." Alfie then found out that Toby had bought a new phone only yesterday. He felt so much better inside now that he had cleared the air, and felt that it was all well worth not having his brother's old phone for the comfort he felt inside. Having a furtive feel of his ears, he couldn't begin to say how pleased he was that they had returned to their old normal self. A week later, Alfie was thoroughly enjoying a tasty hot chocolate, sitting perched on the sofa, watching one of his favourite television programs. At one of the funniest points in the story, forgetting he had his hot chocolate in his hands, Alfie started rocking about in laughter. It really was so funny. His laughter soon stopped when he realized he had shaken his drink all over the carpet. This now had a dark stain on it in the shape of some undiscovered country on the globe. Panic struck, and Alfie looked round to see if anyone was coming. No one was around, so he pulled the sofa forward to hide the dark blob of chocolate milk. Before he could even sigh with relief, his nose started wiggling, tingling, and apparently growing. Once again, the cavities within his nose seemed to be taking on a most unfamiliar feeling. Even more panic set in, but Alfie rushed into the kitchen to find his mum and poured out his sorry tale of the spilt drink. Naturally, his mum said he should try to be a bit more careful, but she assured him that she had some miracle cleaner that took stains from carpets, particularly very fresh spills. Oh, it was so much better that he had told her straight away. What if Mum had found the stain days later when it was all dried and crusty? She certainly wouldn't have been so pleased, and Alfie would probably have had to experience seeing that oh so very angry scowling face of grown-ups which he hated so much. Not long after this, Alfie was delighted to find that it was half-term. A whole week of no Mr. Tompkin lay ahead. Also, his brother Toby was spending a couple of days with his friend, so Alfie thought that this was an ideal opportunity to try using the bright purple Diablo of his big brother. In true brotherly fashion, Toby has always found a reason for Alfie not to play with it. Naturally, because of this lack of practice, Alfie's attempts to fling the Diablo into the air were not greatly successful. Even less successful were his attempts to catch it on the string. How did these older people manage to do it? As the whole game seemed less and less interesting, Alfie gave one last toss, and the purple Diablo soared even further up into the air. Just as quickly as it went up, Alfie saw it quickly descend, but nowhere near his string. Instead, it went straight onto his mum's flower pot, bounced off, and then hit her precious ceramic toadstools that she had placed in the pot. Suddenly, there was a pile of broken terracotta pot mixed with the coloured broken pieces of toadstools. Oh no, what would his mother say now? With a glance over his shoulder, he realized that no one was watching, so he quickly gathered them up with his foot and went to hide them all in the flower bed, which was now full of undergrowth. No sooner than he'd started doing this, Alfie felt an extraordinary sensation in his head. There was a quivering and a fluttering feeling in his hair, and seeing the reflection of himself in the pond, he realized that his curls, which usually dropped over his eye, were beginning to stand on end and were jittering and vibrating all over the place. Alfie, who was beginning to get used to these strange occurrences, suddenly stopped what he was doing and ran indoors to find his mum. She was baking what smelt like a very tasty chocolate cake, and didn't notice Alfie at first. but by the time she did see him, his hair sensation was beginning to subside. He immediately poured out to his mum, in words that were twice as fast as was usual to speak, the sad tale of the broken toadstools, punctuated by a few tears and lots of guilt-ridden sorries. He finally finished by telling his mum that he'd saved up lots of pocket money, and he would surely be able to buy some more toadstools that may even be a prettier colour. As soon as he had said all this, Alfie tentatively felt his hair. The quivering and fluttering had definitely stopped, and sure enough, his familiar curls were there, sitting on his head as they should be. Alfie's mother was so delighted that he had confessed to his accident rather than try to hide it, that she gave him one of those lovely grown-up hugs and said that she was obviously sad that her toadstools and pot were broken, but she was certainly not as sad as she would have been if he'd tried to hide it from her. Maybe they could go together to the garden centre and choose some new toadstools. Alfie was beginning to realize that grown-ups may well surprise you with their reactions. But this reaction was certainly better than the angry, scowling reception he so dreaded. Alfie had one more lesson before this moral experience was finally learnt. But you are going to hear how this event in Alfie's life finally made him realize what he should do. As you have heard, his chocolate-brown curls and endearing dimple made Alfie seem most very captivating, and I will now add that he was also blessed with a very inquisitive nature. One cold autumn day, when he visited his granny and grandpa, he was interested to see another gadget that his grandpa had created. It appeared to have several interesting knobs and switches, but what really caught Alfie's attention were the bright, shiny, silver-mounded discs at the front of this box, which turned out to play music. His inquisitive fingers were even more inquisitive than his endearing face, and he couldn't stop himself poking this bright, shiny mound. But Alfie had not realized that this would be quite as delicate as it turned out to be, and this interesting silver mound instantly turned into a crumpled silver crater. Alfie was shocked and started to look around to see if anyone had noticed. No one was around, but something made Alfie check his ears, hair, and fingers, almost all in one go. Apart from his slightly fluttering heart, all seemed well, just in time for Alfie to realize he must go and tell his grandpa what he'd done. Alfie really didn't want any other part of his body to start misbehaving. He went up to his grandpa with a very sorrowful face and explained what he had done. Grandpa listened and said that he was so very pleased that his grandson had confessed so honestly to what he had done, although he added that it was a bit of a shame that the finished look was not quite as pristine as it was, but at the end of the day, to achieve honesty was far better. And Alfie also realized that he felt so much better inside for having confessed to the possible peccadillo. Suddenly he realized that he wasn't worrying about the state of his fingers or ears or hair, but that he really did feel better inside for being honest and open with those he loved. Alfie, the little boy with the endearing dimple and chocolate-brown curly hair that had one particular curl dropping over his right eye, had learnt a very important lesson in life, and would forever feel so much better for it. So you are bound to find yourselves in a difficult position many times in your life, and when you do, remember Alfie. Be honest and admit what you have done, because when you don't, that feeling inside is not good, and also the problem can often become a lot worse or make someone a lot more angry. And of course, watch out for your ears.